The cold air bit at Elena's skin as she stepped out of the diner, her thin winter coat barely protecting her against the freezing wind. It was late, far past her usual shift end, but she couldn't just leave her. The little girl, barely 8 years old, was sitting outside the diner, her teeth chattering, wearing nothing but a thin sweater and ragged shoes. The streetlights flickered above, casting long, eerie shadows. Elena's heart twisted. The child was alone, frozen to the bone, and her eyes were wide with fear. Without a second thought, Elena took off her coat, wrapping it around the girl's frail shoulders. The girl's lips trembled as she whispered, "Thank you." Elena gave her a warm smile, though her own fingers were numb. But she didn't stop there. She took the girl inside, letting her sit at the counter, ordering her a hot meal. The diner was nearly empty, save for a few late-night customers. Elena felt a warmth spreading through her chest, but it didn't last. The owner of the diner, Mr. Hartley, was already looking at her, his frown deepening. Elena's heart sank. She knew she'd broken the rules. But as she met his gaze, all she could think about was that little girl, out there, freezing alone. She didn't know it yet, but the next morning would bring news that would change everything. Elena had always been the type of person who found it hard to say no. Growing up in a small, tight-knit neighborhood, she had learned early on that people mattered more than rules. Her mother, a single parent, worked double shifts at the laundromat, and Elena often found herself stepping into the role of caretaker for her younger brother, Joey. They didn't have much, but they had each other, and that was enough. After high school, Elena moved to the city, hoping for something better. She found work at Hartley's Diner, a place where the hours were long and the tips barely covered her bills. Still, she was grateful for the job. It gave her enough to scrape by, and she'd grown fond of the regulars, people who, like her, lived on the edges of the world. But Elena's life wasn't exactly what she dreamed. It was a constant cycle of work, pay bills, work some more. She'd had a few relationships that never lasted long enough to feel real, and her family, though still close, often felt like distant echoes. The sacrifices she made for others were second nature to her, a quiet form of selflessness that no one truly noticed. When the little girl had walked into the diner that night, Elena didn't even think twice about offering her coat. It wasn't about doing the right thing. It was about doing the only thing that felt right in the moment. Elena had become accustomed to putting others first, even if it meant sacrificing her own comfort, her own well-being. But it had never felt like a burden. Until now. Mr. Hartley's eyes had burned into her back as she helped the girl, but she hadn't cared. Or rather, she hadn't realized the weight of what that moment might cost her. As she watched the girl leave the diner that night, Elena's thoughts lingered on what was to come, and what she might be risking for someone else. The next morning, Elena's body ached from lack of sleep, but the unease in her chest was what kept her awake. She had just enough time to get ready for her shift when she heard a knock on her apartment door. Her stomach dropped. She wasn't expecting anyone, but the moment she opened the door, Mr. Hartley stood there, his face grim. "Elena, we need to talk," he said, his voice as cold as the weather outside. Her heart sank. She already knew what he was going to say. The diner had strict rules about not giving away food or clothing to customers. A single violation could mean immediate dismissal. "I can explain," Elena began, but Mr. Hartley raised his hand to stop her. His frown deepened, but there was something else in his eyes, something that made Elena's breath catch. "That's not why I'm here," he said, stepping inside. "You did something last night that I can't just ignore, but it's not about the coat. It's about the girl you helped." Elena blinked. Her pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Mr. Hartley hesitated before continuing. "The little girl you helped, she's been living on the streets for weeks. Her name's Sarah. She was supposed to be in foster care, but she ran away." Elena's chest tightened. She hadn't known the full story, just that the girl had been cold and alone. "Why didn't you say something last night?" He shook his head. "I didn't know Elena. I thought she was just another runaway." He paused, staring at her. "But there's more." Sarah's been in and out of the system for years, and last night when you gave her your coat, I found out something else. You might not believe this, but her father's been looking for her, and he's not a man you want to mess with." The words hit Elena like a punch to the gut. She had no idea. Her mind raced with possibilities. The father, a man with a reputation for violence, had been searching for his daughter, his little girl who was now gone, thanks to Elena's impulse to help. What had she done? The next few hours felt like a blur. Elena couldn't focus on anything. Her shift, the orders, the customers. She felt like she was living in a fog. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Sarah's trembling face, the look of fear in her eyes when she'd walked into the diner. But now, Elena couldn't shake the thought of her being out there somewhere, scared, with a father who would stop at nothing to get her back. What if that man found her? What if it was Elena's fault? The worst part was she didn't know how to make things right. Helping the girl had felt like the only thing she could do, but now it seemed like everything had spiraled out of control. As she wiped down the counter, Mr. Hartley's words echoed in her head. "You've done a good thing, Elena, but sometimes doing the right thing comes with consequences." But what consequences were waiting for her? The diner felt colder than usual when Elena stepped inside for her evening shift. The hum of the neon sign outside flickered, casting a sickly glow over the empty tables. She wasn't sure what she was expecting, but when a tall figure appeared in the doorway, her heart nearly stopped. It was him, the man who had been searching for Sarah. Elena froze. His presence seemed to fill the room, dark and imposing. He was dressed in a worn leather jacket, his face etched with years of hard living. His eyes, narrow, dangerous, locked onto hers. He didn't need to say a word. His gaze alone was enough to send a chill down her spine. "Where is she?" he demanded, his voice a low growl. Elena swallowed hard, her throat dry. She tried to steady herself, but fear had already gripped her. She had never been good at facing down confrontation, especially not with someone like this. But she couldn't back down. Not now. Not after everything that had happened. I don't know where she is," Elena lied, trying to keep her voice steady, but the tremor in her hands betrayed her. His eyes narrowed. "Don't lie to me." He stepped closer, his shadow swallowing her whole. "You helped her, didn't you? I know she was here last night." Elena's heart raced. She wanted to scream, to run, but she forced herself to stay still. I gave her my coat," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know who she was." The man's face twisted with a mixture of anger and desperation. "You've made a mistake, girl, and you're going to pay for it." Every instinct in Elena told her to back away, but something inside her snapped. She couldn't let this man intimidate her. She couldn't let him control her fear anymore. She stood tall, meeting his gaze. "If you want to hurt her, you'll have to go through me." The man's eyes flashed with surprise, then something darker, almost like a flicker of respect. He studied Elena for a long moment, sizing her up, his fists clenching and unclenching by his sides. For a heartbeat, she thought he might lash out, but then with a low growl, he backed away, his gaze still fixed on her. "You think you can stop me?" His voice was rough, but now it held a trace of uncertainty. "I'm not trying to stop you," Elena said, the words coming out sharper than she intended. "I'm trying to keep her safe." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "You don't know what you're dealing with." But there was a hesitation in his step as he turned to leave, like he wasn't entirely sure anymore if chasing Sarah was worth it. As he disappeared into the night, Elena's breath caught in her chest. She had never faced down someone like him before, but she had never cared about anything as much as she did now. The adrenaline that had coursed through her veins began to fade, leaving a cold sense of dread in its wake. Was it really over? Had she done enough to keep Sarah safe, or had she just made everything worse? She couldn't shake the feeling that the man would return, that he wouldn't give up so easily. But for now, at least, she had bought the girl some time. And that was something. The next day, Elena didn't go to work. She couldn't. The weight of the night before pressed on her like a heavy stone. She knew she couldn't just wait for the storm to hit. She needed to do more. With a sudden resolve, Elena made a decision. She would find Sarah. She wouldn't wait for things to unfold on their own. She had put everything on the line for a child she barely knew, and now she had to see it through. There was no turning back. Elena's search for Sarah took her down every alley, through every neighborhood, and into places she never thought she would venture. Days passed with little hope, but the urgency never left her. Each night, she thought about the man, how he would keep hunting, how relentless he would be until he found his daughter. But each morning, as she scoured the streets again, a small part of her kept fighting. She couldn't just stop. Not now. Then, on the fourth day, Elena found Sarah. She was huddled in the doorway of an old building on the edge of town, clutching a bag of food with both hands. When their eyes met, Sarah didn't speak, but she didn't need to. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared bond forged in a moment of fear and kindness. Elena knelt down, offering her coat again, her heart pounding. "You're safe now," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "We're going to get you out of here." The girl nodded slowly, and for the first time in days, Elena allowed herself to feel something other than fear. Hope. Together, they walked to the police station, where Sarah's situation was finally addressed, and the authorities could begin the process of reuniting her with the right people. A week later, Sarah was placed in a new foster home, one that promised stability and care. Elena knew that her role in all of this wasn't over. But as she watched the girl leave the diner for the last time, a sense of relief washed over her. She had done the right thing. And sometimes, that was all that mattered. Sometimes, doing the right thing isn't about finding the easiest or safest path. It's about stepping into the unknown, even when the cost is high. Elena's choice to help Sarah, despite the dangers and consequences, shows that the power of compassion can be greater than fear. Even in moments when everything seems to be falling apart, standing up for what's right can create ripples that change lives. The story reminds us that there is strength in vulnerability and courage in selflessness. When we put others first, we may face hardships, but we also discover the depths of our own resilience. In the end, it's not just about what we gain, but what we give that defines who we are.